A software developer might have a different mental image of software than their users, and the users might have a different mental image than the stakeholders. However, since it's a user who will be using it, shouldn't they be the one with the most consideration for the interface? This is why we have the analysis of our user interfaces. It lets us analyze and determine, is this the best way? Now, just because we're going to focus on the end user doesn't necessarily mean that when we talk to them, we're going to give them everything they want. Henry Ford, the automobile magnate, is often quoted as saying, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So think about what you will ask your users and what type of answers they're going to give you. And sometimes you have to take it with a bit of salt. Also, you need to know that users can sometimes get easily sidetracked about things that don't matter. Things like the color or size of screen or the position of a specific element. They may not be thinking about the many other users who are using it, just them. I had an experience with one person who always wanted whatever it was to be more blue. It didn't matter what the conversation was about. It didn't matter what we were discussing and using. It always needed to be more blue because that was her favorite color. Now, I like the color blue just fine. It's also my favorite color. But that's not always relevant to the conversation we have. So when we work with our end users, we need to figure out what's relevant and how do we ask them those relevant types of questions. We need to be thinking about the user. And in doing so, there's a couple of good questions we can ask. Some of these are going to be things like, are they a technical or experienced person? If so, how technical and experienced are they? How much education do they have? A great example of this is actually the business McDonald's. Now you might think, well, why would that be so important? Well, if you go behind the scenes of McDonald's and look at how they build everything from hamburgers to take orders, you'll find they use a lot of pictographic types of tools. This is going to allow there to not be a base required education level for them to hire from. This is important because often they hire people who are still even in high school. And so trying to say, well, you need to have a college degree to read this instruction manual would be frustrating to them. And they couldn't necessarily fill the slots. So they worked at simplifying it as much as possible. On the other hand, if you're building an application that's only going to be used by postdocs or maybe people who are professors and researchers, you can do things differently because a pictograph might actually slow them down. In addition to things like their ability, skills, and education, you might even know about things like their age. Will their age or physical limitations limit what can be done? Think about your eyesight. I think about this a lot because I have to wear glasses. And as I have gotten older and my glasses have had to change and now I have bifocals, I have to think about, can I read this instructions on whatever it is I'm looking at? Okay? This can limit me. A couple of years ago, I built a website. The target age for their customers was about 55. Because of this, I made all the font sizes just a little bit bigger. Why? Because I know that people that age sometimes don't like to admit that they need glasses, but they do. I wanted to make it easy. I didn't make it so big that it was comical and it would insult anyone, but by making it just a little bit bigger, I made it a lot easier for them to use. I'm also going to be mindful of things like, are they potentially colorblind? You'd be surprised how many people out there are colorblind. And colorblind doesn't mean you just see in black and white. There are various forms and shades of colorblindness. The one that's most common is actually called red-green, and it's where the colors red and green are easy to get confused. So think about those types of things when we talk about potential physical limitations. Next, will this be used all the time or only occasionally? Something I use all the time is easy for me to remember. One of the places I worked, we did training for our applications. And the most common application we trained was for handing out W-2s and 1099s. Why? Because people only had to do it one time a year. And they might do 100 of them or 1,000 of them that one time a year. And in the month of December and January, they got them all taken care of. But then they had 11 months to forget how to do it. On the other hand, we had other applications that we only periodically gave training for because the people who used it knew how to use it because they were in it all the time. And the only time we really needed to train people on it was when they were starting. Another thing we have to consider is, will people with different primary languages be using this application? Many of our applications we'll think of are written in a single language. But do we need to have translations available for other users? A good friend of mine was working for a large multinational company, and he was saying that there were 5 main languages that they supported in their Central Florida office. That didn't include the offices around the world. He just worked in the Central Florida office, and he was supporting 5 major languages. Why? Because it's easier to work with the language that you grew up with, because that's what you think in. And if you don't have to translate in your head, you can be a whole lot more faster and more efficient. Of course, there are many more questions that can be asked. Some are going to depend upon the application that you're building, while others will sometimes depend upon your own experience. When you think about a task the user must perform, it is helpful to make sure that everything they need to do is going to be easily accessible. To help you kind of figure out that stuff, think about some of these things, like what work will the user be performing under certain circumstances? What tasks and subtasks will need to be performed as the user does the work? What specific problem domain objects will the user manipulate as the work is performed? What is the sequence of work tasks in the workflow? What is a hierarchy of tasks that they're going to have to do? If this sounds familiar, it's because it's very similar to use cases that you've hopefully already created in your project. Therefore, you can use these use cases to help you identify what the task and subtask will be and what the end user is going to need in order to accomplish them.